Ladies and gentlemen, the situation in Syria is shifting with alarming speed as the Kurdish hold over key regions is rapidly collapsing. And what we are witnessing now is more than just a military setback. It is a profound reshaping of power in the Middle East. For years, Kurdish forces maintained a fragile yet significant control over northern Syria, balancing relationships with regional powers, international allies, and local communities. That balance, however, is now disintegrating under the combined pressures of Turkish incursions, Syrian government offensives, and internal fragmentation. This collapse is creating a vacuum that multiple actors are rushing to fill, from the Assad regime seeking to reassert sovereignty to extremist factions exploiting instability, and even neighboring states calculating their next strategic moves. The speed and complexity of this power struggle raise urgent questions about the future of regional security, humanitarian stability, and the geopolitical calculations of global powers invested in Syria. The ramifications of Kurdish withdrawal extend beyond territorial loss. They touch on alliances, trust, and the very fabric of governance in contested areas. Kurdish forces, once lauded for their coordination with international coalitions in the fight against extremist groups, are now facing a situation where former partners must reconsider engagement and support. Meanwhile, civilians caught in the crossfire face displacement, violence, and uncertainty on a scale that echoes earlier crises in the region. Observers note that the collapse is not only a story of military pressure but also of political isolation, economic deprivation, and strategic overextension. The Kurdish administration's ability to govern and defend territory was always contingent on external support and internal cohesion, and with both eroding, the consequences are cascading rapidly across northern Syria. International actors are watching closely, recognizing that Syria's northern regions are now a strategic chessboard. Turkey's operations are calculated to secure borders and suppress Kurdish autonomy, while the Assad government is eager to reclaim lost territory and reassert central authority. Meanwhile, Russia and Iran, key backers of Damascus, are maneuvering to solidify influence, using this transitional period to expand control over energy routes, infrastructure, and military positions. The situation creates a volatile dynamic where local actors must navigate alliances that shift daily, and where the collapse of Kurdish control serves as both a warning and an opportunity for those seeking regional leverage. As the Kurdish presence diminishes, the humanitarian and geopolitical stakes cannot be overstated. Cities and towns are vulnerable to lawlessness, insurgent activity, and forced population movements, threatening stability for millions of residents. The power struggle unfolding now is not isolated. It reverberates across borders, influencing U.S., European, and Middle Eastern strategies, shaping military deployments, humanitarian aid, and diplomatic calculations alike. In this moment of upheaval, Syria's northern regions stand as a stark reminder that power is transient, control is contested, and the consequences of collapse ripple far beyond the immediate battlefield. Kurdish control collapses. The collapse of Kurdish control in northern Syria represents a critical turning point in the ongoing conflict, signaling both the fragility of local governance structures and the volatility of territorial authority in contested regions. For years, Kurdish forces had established a network of administration, security, and social services that, while limited in resources, provided a degree of stability and predictability in areas long subjected to conflict and instability. This control, however, was always contingent on maintaining a careful balance between internal cohesion and external alliances, and the erosion of either has now triggered a rapid unraveling. Military pressure from multiple fronts, including incursions by Turkish forces, operations by the Syrian government, and pressure from extremist factions, has significantly strained Kurdish defenses. At the same time, political isolation and diminishing international support have exacerbated vulnerabilities, leaving Kurdish-held territories exposed to both strategic and opportunistic threats. The loss of control is not merely a matter of geography. It is a collapse of institutional capacity, civil governance, and the enforcement of security mechanisms that had sustained local populations for years. This vacuum has immediate implications for the social and political fabric of northern Syria. Cities and towns once administered under Kurdish governance face uncertainty over law enforcement, resource allocation, and civil order, creating conditions in which criminal networks and insurgent groups can exploit instability. The sudden reduction in Kurdish authority also disrupts economic activity, as trade routes, local markets, and supply chains that relied on security and predictability are now subject to interference, extortion, and confiscation by competing forces. For civilians, the collapse translates into a daily reality of heightened insecurity, constrained mobility, and increased exposure to violence, underscoring the human cost of strategic and territorial failures. From a strategic perspective, the loss of Kurdish control alters the calculations of every actor involved in the Syrian conflict. Former allies, including international coalitions, must reconsider the reliability and sustainability of Kurdish partnerships, while adversaries interpret the collapse as an opportunity to expand influence and assert dominance. The shift in territorial control demonstrates that in conflict zones, authority is inherently unstable and that the presence or absence of governance structures directly shapes both security outcomes and geopolitical leverage. The rapid unraveling of Kurdish administration in northern Syria therefore serves as a stark reminder that territorial control, once assumed to be stable, can collapse under pressure, with immediate and far-reaching consequences for both local populations and regional strategic dynamics. As Kurdish control collapses, multiple regional and international powers are moving quickly to assert influence, transforming northern Syria into a complex and high-stakes geopolitical arena. Turkey, the Assad regime, Russia, and Iran are each calculating how to maximize strategic advantage amid the vacuum, and their actions illustrate the competing interests that define the Syrian conflict. Turkey's operations, for example, are explicitly aimed at suppressing Kurdish autonomy near its border while securing a buffer zone for its national security interests, creating both immediate military pressure and long-term territorial claims. Simultaneously, the Assad government seeks to reassert sovereignty over areas it has been unable to govern effectively, using both military presence and political leverage to consolidate authority. Russia and Iran, key allies of Damascus, are maneuvering to expand their strategic influence by securing energy routes, infrastructure, and military positions, taking advantage of the fluid situation to strengthen their footholds in the region. The convergence of these actors creates a dynamic environment in which alliances are tentative, territorial control is constantly contested, and decision-making must account for both local conditions and broader regional implications. The involvement of multiple powers has amplified the complexity of governance and security for civilians, local militias, and remaining Kurdish forces. Each actor brings distinct military capabilities, operational strategies, and political objectives, which do not always align, creating unpredictable outcomes on the ground. Civilian populations find themselves navigating shifting authorities and inconsistent enforcement of security, while local administrative structures are disrupted or co-opted by competing actors. Economically, the presence of multiple powers complicates trade, resource distribution, and reconstruction efforts, as control over key supply routes and infrastructure becomes a tool for both leverage and coercion. At the same time, the fluidity of territorial authority increases the risk of miscalculation, as overlapping military operations by different powers can lead to unintended escalation or conflict spillover. This high-stakes maneuvering also carries broader geopolitical consequences, drawing the attention of global actors including the United States, the European Union, and neighboring Middle Eastern states. Each evaluates the shifts in control to recalibrate strategic priorities, from military deployments to humanitarian aid and diplomatic engagement. The presence of multiple powers competing for influence in northern Syria underscores a central lesson of the conflict. Territorial vacuums are rarely neutral spaces, and when authority collapses, every actor seeks to fill the void to advance strategic objectives, often at the expense of local populations and long-term stability. The rapid convergence of competing interests illustrates that power vacuums in Syria are inherently volatile, shaping both regional security dynamics and the broader geopolitical landscape in ways that demand careful observation and analysis. The humanitarian consequences of the Kurdish collapse are immediate, severe, and far-reaching, affecting hundreds of thousands of civilians across northern Syria. Displacement is accelerating as families flee areas of active conflict, seeking safety from ongoing military operations, airstrikes, and the threat of extremist factions exploiting the power vacuum. This mass movement of populations is creating immense pressure on neighboring communities and border regions, which are often already strained by years of prolonged conflict and limited infrastructure. Access to basic necessities such as food, water, and medical care is increasingly constrained, as administrative structures previously managed by Kurdish authorities are dismantled or rendered ineffective. Hospitals, schools, and local governance bodies that once provided a degree of stability are now functioning under extreme duress or are completely non-operational, creating conditions in which vulnerability, uncertainty, and social disruption are magnified on a daily basis. In addition to the physical threats, the collapse has significant psychological and social ramifications for the civilian population. Communities that had relied on Kurdish governance for security and dispute resolution are suddenly exposed to competing authorities with differing priorities, methods, and degrees of legitimacy. This environment fosters tension, mistrust, and fear, particularly as local actors are forced to navigate interactions with multiple armed groups, some of which may be hostile to Kurdish civilians or sympathetic to opposing factions. Economic stability is also undermined, as marketplaces, transportation networks, and employment opportunities are disrupted. Families that depend on local commerce or agriculture face immediate threats to livelihoods, further exacerbating humanitarian needs and increasing the reliance on aid organizations that are themselves constrained by security challenges. The humanitarian crisis is compounded by the lack of coordinated international response in an environment where multiple powers exert influence. Aid delivery is complicated by shifting front lines, military operations, and the political considerations of regional and global actors, which often restrict access or delay assistance. Civilians are left navigating a landscape of uncertainty, where safety and resources are contingent on rapidly changing control of territory. The Kurdish collapse thus illustrates the intrinsic link between political military developments and human security. The breakdown of governance, coupled with competing external actors, creates conditions in which the civilian population bears the immediate cost of strategic maneuvering. This reality highlights that in conflict zones, the human consequences of shifting power dynamics are both immediate and profound, requiring sustained attention and urgent intervention to mitigate suffering, stabilize communities, and prevent further escalation of displacement, insecurity, and humanitarian catastrophe. The fragility of alliances in northern Syria has become starkly evident as Kurdish forces lose control, exposing the tenuous nature of partnerships built on convenience rather than long-term stability. For years, Kurdish groups maintained relationships with international coalitions, including the United States and European partners, relying on external support from military, logistical, and intelligence resources. These alliances were crucial for sustaining territorial control and combating extremist groups. However, as the situation deteriorates, these relationships are strained, revealing the limits of dependency on external actors whose interests may shift rapidly in response to political pressures, changing priorities, or regional calculations. The Kurdish collapse underscores that in conflict zones, alliances are inherently fragile, and the effectiveness of support is contingent on consistent commitment, mutual trust, and the alignment of strategic objectives. The dynamics of these fragile alliances have practical implications on the ground. Military operations that once coordinated with international partners now face disruptions due to shifting support, including delayed reinforcements, reductions in supply, and diminished intelligence sharing. Such disruptions have tangible consequences for both strategic planning and the protection of civilian populations. In addition, local governance and security structures that relied on international legitimacy may lose credibility, further weakening the ability of Kurdish forces to maintain order and negotiate with neighboring powers. The erosion of these alliances also has a cascading effect on the broader conflict, influencing the calculations of rival actors such as the Assad regime, Turkey, Russia, and Iran. Observing the weakening of Kurdish partnerships, these actors may interpret the situation as an opportunity to expand influence, consolidate territorial control, or renegotiate agreements with local populations and militias. The collapse of alliances highlights a critical lesson about the limits of external intervention in conflict zones. Relationships built on temporary convenience or transactional support are vulnerable to rapid disruption under conditions of stress and uncertainty. For Kurdish forces, the loss of external backing exposes structural weaknesses in governance, command, and coordination, emphasizing the importance of internal cohesion and sustainable partnerships. Moreover, the fragility of alliances illustrates how global powers, while influential, cannot guarantee local stability without sustained engagement, strategic alignment, and consideration of long-term consequences. In this context, the breakdown of Kurdish alliances functions as both a strategic warning and a case study in the inherent volatility of coalition-dependent governance, revealing that even long-standing partnerships can unravel quickly when confronted with shifting military pressures, political calculations, and competing regional interests. The Syrian experience demonstrates that the durability of alliances is directly linked to the capacity of local actors to navigate complex networks of support, negotiate competing interests, and maintain operational coherence under extreme pressure. The collapse of Kurdish control in northern Syria carries far-reaching regional and global implications, influencing the strategic calculations of powers both near and distant. The instability created by the rapid erosion of Kurdish authority reverberates across the Middle East, affecting neighboring countries such as Turkey, Iraq, and Jordan, each of which monitors the situation closely to assess potential threats to borders, refugee flows, and security interests. Turkey, in particular, has leveraged the vacuum to advance its own territorial objectives and counter perceived Kurdish threats along its southern border, while the Syrian government views the collapse as an opportunity to reassert sovereignty over regions long outside its control. Meanwhile, Iran and Russia, as key backers of Damascus, are strategically positioning themselves to consolidate influence over infrastructure, energy routes, and military assets, ensuring that the redistribution of power benefits their long-term regional agendas. The unfolding events in northern Syria therefore cannot be understood in isolation. They are part of a broader web of regional dynamics in which local shifts immediately translate into strategic recalculations. At the same time, global actors such as the United States, European Union, and international humanitarian organizations are compelled to reevaluate their engagement strategies. Military deployments, intelligence support, and diplomatic initiatives must be reassessed in light of the new territorial realities, with the collapse of Kurdish control prompting questions about the sustainability of prior commitments, the protection of civilian populations, and the long-term balance of power in the region. The rapid transformation of control also underscores the limitations of prior strategies that relied heavily on the stability of Kurdish forces as intermediaries for combating extremist groups and maintaining local governance. The sudden vacuum introduces uncertainty into both operational planning and broader policy objectives, forcing stakeholders to adapt quickly to shifting alliances, emerging threats, and unpredictable territorial changes. In practical terms, the global consequences of the Kurdish collapse are multidimensional. Energy security, refugee management, counterterrorism operations, and diplomatic negotiations are all affected by the fluidity of authority on the ground. The collapse also serves as a cautionary example of how localized power shifts can trigger cascading effects that extend well beyond immediate geographic boundaries, affecting regional security architectures, international aid distribution, and strategic military postures. The situation demonstrates that in the interconnected geopolitical environment of the Middle East, even the loss of control by a single local actor can reshape alliances, recalibrate risk assessments, and compel global powers to adjust both their short-term operations and long-term policy frameworks. Northern Syria's unfolding power struggle exemplifies how local instability can transform into a matter of regional and international significance, highlighting the inseparable links between local authority, humanitarian security, and global strategic interests.